aeration options? I know there are some people who are adding in, like I used to add in perlite, some people add in pumice, vermiculite, lava rock. There's a lot of different aeration options. What aeration options do you recommend, and at what ratio aeration to cocoa?
It depends on container size. Container size depends primarily on watering frequency. So if you're going to be the type of grower that only wants to water their plants once or twice a day, and I realize that might sound like pretty frequently, but I advocate high frequency fertigation in cocoa. So higher than that. So once or twice a day, you're going to want a larger container. If you're going to go 5-6 times a day, you're going to be able to get away with a smaller container. And I encourage you to kind of think of the container that you're growing in as like the cup that you give like your guests at a party. Okay. And so if you give them a small cup, you better be running around and refilling their cups all of the time, right? If you give them a larger cup, like, you know, you don't have to fill up their cups all the time. So watering in this sense is filling up the cup, right? And yeah, if you're going to water 6 times a day, then you can grow big plants in a 1-gallon container. And I totally endorse that style. If you're going to only water once a day, then you can grow that same plant in a 3 or a 5-gallon container, and that would be a better option. Now, your question's actually about perlite, right? So the perlite ratio depends on the size of the container and to some extent your watering frequency as well. Larger containers, I like to put more perlite in, more of that aeration. In general, it certainly aerates. Perlite certainly aerates. It's really what we're hoping to get out of the perlite is improved drainage. Cocoa holds on to water a little bit too well, basically. So we like to encourage the water to drain out a little bit easier, and that's one of the good things that perlite does. Cocoa, unless you have all dust, remember we're talking about like chips and you have fibers in addition to your dust, then cocoa stays pretty well oxygenated even if it's pure cocoa and even if it's at field capacity, which means like fully saturated. There's still oxygen available to the plant. But what happens if you're in a large enough container, and you know, it's the dissolved oxygen in the water accounts for a large proportion of the available oxygen to plants. And if you're watering infrequently, especially if you're watering less than once per day, and especially if the water sitting in the pots is above 70 degrees, which it almost always is in our gardens, after a few hours, there's not going to be a lot of dissolved oxygen in that water. It's going to be hypoxic. And if you have an area that doesn't have a lot of roots, so the roots are actually where most of the water gets taken up, right? We often think about the water sort of like just pouring through the pots, but we're filling a cup and then the plant is like drinking that cup, right? This is one of the reasons we transplant up to make sure there's roots all the way in the center, because it's really right in the middle of, like, you have a big pot, right in the middle of that pot, the roots tend to grow around it. They grow out to the edges, they grow down to the bottom, and they'll leave this area in the middle of the pot that doesn't have a lot of roots sucking out the water, and the water's allowed to get sort of like stagnant there. If it doesn't have enough perlite to sort of vertically flow through, it'll become hypoxic, and that's basically a dead zone for roots because there's no oxygen for them. So if you're growing in like a big container, get a lot of aeration in the middle of that. Make sure that, you know, the water is going to continue to move through there, because roots like that area less, and it tends to become sort of stagnant and not as well sort of oxygenated. Conversely, if you're growing a big plant in a 1-gallon pot, you don't need perlite. In fact, Adding too much perlite just sort of cuts down on the amount of water that you can store in that pot, because, a 1 gallon pot that's full up with 100% cocoa can hold a little over half a gallon of water. A 1 gallon pot that's stock full of like 50-50 cocoa perlite can hold less than half a gallon of water. So you're sort of cutting back sort of the reservoir function of the pot for the plants, and that's going to require you to increase fertigation more. So yeah, it depends. I go anywhere from no perlite to only like 10 to 20%, sometimes up to 50% perlite in a larger container with less frequent watering.
So perlite is your go-to. You don't recommend like vermiculite or lava rock, any of those other options?
And perlite's definitely my go-to, or one of the specific perlite substitutes. I don't think vermiculite is a good substitute for perlite in cocoa, for this purpose at least. Vermiculite tends to hold on to water more. It does do some of the same aeration, but it's not as good at sort of aiding in drainage as perlite is. Lava rock can work for this. There are other things that you can substitute perlite for, and I'm aware that some growers don't like to use perlite specifically. I will say that there's a couple of drawbacks to using perlite that should be mentioned, I think, whenever it's brought up. Do not allow yourself to breathe perlite dust, ever. It's rock dust. It causes, it's like so much worse than smoking. I mean, it's so much worse than like anything else you can do. Get a respirator or a ventilator, do it in an outdoor space, at least wear like an N95 mask or something. Just, I see so many people either on sort of videos or in real life or walking through commercial facilities where people are dealing with perlite, just breathing in this cloud of perlite dust. Disaster. Don't put yourself in that situation. It's rock dust. It kill you. So that's one of the issues. Perlite's also, a mined resource, and there's a limited sort of global supply of perlite. But we're not sort of at a threshold. I actually think the peat is a bigger issue to be worried about and concerned in those regards, in terms of, how sustainable the mining of the resource is.
Good advice on the mask. I don't wear a mask, and I probably should. I don't really hear people talking about the safety behind handling perlite, so I'll definitely be wearing a mask moving forward.
Yeah, get the vents on or whatever you can do to, whenever you pour perlite, and get it wet right away to knock down that cloud of dust, right? But if you get a bag of perlite and you pour it, you're going to have this like cloud of rock dust that you get to breathe in.
This clip is brought to you by AC Infinity. Use discount code MrGrow at 15 to save on any of their products.